In the last section, we generated our OAuth client ID. So now the next thing we're going to do is install the Google API library into our project. Now, unfortunately, Google themselves do not offer this library over NPM, so we're not going to install it via NPM. Instead, we're just going to add a manual script tag into our index.html file. So to get started, I'm going to open up my code editor. I'll find my public directory and open up the index.html file inside there. I'll then find the head tag, and anywhere inside of the head tag, I'm going to add in a script tag, like so. And then I'm going to give it a source of https://apis.google.com/js/api.js, like so. And that's pretty much it. So then I'll save this and then flip back over to the browser. Now, once I'm back over here, I'm going to make sure that I refresh the page, and then I'm going to open up my JavaScript console. Once I have this open, I should be able to write out GAPI like so. And I should see an object like this right here appear. So this object right here is the Google API that is available to us on the Windows scope inside of our browser. So we're now going to create a new React component that's going to essentially wrap this Google library and usher our user through the entire OAuth process. We're going to have a discussion later on about how much of this auth stuff should be included inside of Redux versus React, but for right now, we're just going to get our OAuth flow working in React alone. So inside my code editor, I'm going to find my components directory, and inside there, I'll make a new file called googleauth.js, like so. And then inside of here, I'm going to put together some boilerplate for a class-based component. So I'll say import React from React. I'll then define a class of Google Auth extends React.component. I'll put together my render method. I'll return, for right now, a simple div that says Google Auth. And then, of course, I'll do my export default Google Auth at the bottom. Next up, I'm going to flip back over to my not the app file. I'm going to flip over to the header because we want to eventually show a button related to authentication in the header. So we're going to hook up this component right here inside of our header component. I'll open up header.js, and in the very top, I'll put an import Google Auth from Google Auth, like so. I'll then find the div with the class name of right menu. Inside there is the one link tag right now. And so right next to that, I'm going to create an instance of my Google Auth React component. All right, so let's save that. We'll flip back over, and I'm just going to make sure that I see the text Google Auth appear inside my application, inside the header specifically. And there it is right there, so that looks pretty good. All right, so now that we've got a component put together, I want to tell you a little bit more about how this Google API library works. You see this GAPI thing right here is a multi-purpose Google API library, and we can use it to interact with the OAuth flow, but we can also use it to work with all different types of Google services. Now, this GAPI library is incredibly used or incredibly well distributed across the internet. A tremendous number of websites load up this library. So as such, Google tries to keep this library as small as possible. So anytime that we want to use some particular aspect of functionality in this library, we have to first literally load up the JavaScript code related to the part of the library that we want to use. When you print out GAPI right now, you'll see that it only has a single function tied to it called load. Load right here literally means load up some internal library by making a follow-up request over to Google servers and fetching some additional amount of JavaScript code, and then adding it essentially to this Google library. So to do so, we're going to call gapi.load, and then we're going to pass in a string of client:auth2, like so. Now, if you open up your network request tab before running that and clear your console or clear the log right there and make sure you're filtering by all, we can then run that line of code and we'll see this additional request automatically made to fetch some additional JavaScript code and load it up into that library. So now that that request has been completed, we can then do a gapi.client. Actually, let's just print out gapi by itself, and you'll very quickly see that it has some additional properties inside that object. So here's gapi. Now, in addition to that load function, we also have a couple of other functions inside of here as well. We have something called auth2 and client and so on. And as you might guess, that auth2 stuff is pretty darn relevant for what we're going to be trying to do. Okay, so after we load up that additional library, we can then register or initialize it with our OAuth client ID by calling gapi.client.init. And then we can pass in an object with client ID, and we'll put our client ID in there. I'm not going to actually put it in there. I just want to give you an idea of what we're going to end up doing. Okay, so we're going to essentially flip back over to our Google Auth component and go through this series of steps right here. Now remember, we probably only want to initialize that library or kind of like load up the client portion of the library one time when this component is first rendered onto the screen. So with that in mind, I'm going to define a component did mount lifecycle method inside of the Google Auth component. And then inside of here, we will call window.gapi.load client:auth2 like so. Now we have the window on here to make sure that it's really clear that this is a variable GAPI that is available on Windows scope inside of our browser. If you leave off the window dot and save this, then you're going to very quickly see a warning message saying, hey, this variable right here, GAPI, is not known, even though you and I know that it is available on Windows scope. So if we save that and then flip back over, you're going to very quickly see exactly that error right there. So all we have to do is prefix it with window, and then create React app is going to say, oh, okay, I get it. This variable is available on Windows scope. And so if we flip back over, everything is working again. Okay, so now, anytime that our component is rendered onto the screen, we're going to try to load up that client portion of the library. Now, when we load up that library, it takes some amount of time for the library to reach over to Google servers and download some additional JavaScript code. So we need to essentially get a callback of when that process is complete. So to add in a callback, we can add in a second argument here of an arrow function. And this arrow function is only going to be called after this client auth2 library has been successfully loaded up into GAPI. So then inside of this callback function, we're going to call window.gapi.client.init. And we'll pass in an object, and this object is going to have our client ID. So after we successfully load up the client library, we're going to initialize our application with the client ID that we had generated back in the last video. So I'm going to flip over to that other file that we had created with my OAuth client ID inside of it, and I'm going to copy the entire client ID right here, and then I'll paste it in for my client ID right there, like so. Now there's one other option that we have to paste in here in addition to the client ID. So I'm going to put a comma at the end of that line, and then on the next line down, I'm going to say scope. And so right here, we're going to specify the different scopes that we want to load up when we take the user, or that we want to fetch when the user goes through the OAuth process. As a reminder, the scope stuff is essentially talking about what different parts of the user's profile or the user account that we want to get access to. So in our case, we're just going to say that we want to get access to the user's email. Remember, we're not actually using their email or their profile or anything like that. I just want to give you an example of how we can somehow access their email. All right, so scope right here, as a string, we'll add in email. All right, so that's pretty much it. Now, this right here is just going to initialize the library. It's not going to actually take the user through the OAuth process. Let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to talk about how we can actually use this now initiated GAPI client thing to initiate the OAuth process. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.